Welcome to the final installment of our playing cards design project in Adobe Illustrator. We've done a lot of work to create a very crazy looking card set here, and the very last element for the day is to make a new back that will be used for all of our playing cards. Um, and this final, the 55th artboard in our set, was set up to be our card back. The most common thing for the backs of playing cards is to build some sort of repeating pattern of some kind. And this looks particularly good when you fan out the cards and you're looking at the back side of the cards, because it kind of takes that pattern and stretches it across the backs of the cards. Building a repeating pattern in Adobe Illustrator is very, very easy, and they've built an incredible visual interface for doing so. And so let's walk through that process here today. So I am going to create a new pattern based off of a combination of elements that I have already made. And so I'm going to pop open my symbols panel, and I'm going to make a back pattern based off of my clubs symbol, which, oh, sorry, my layer is locked here. Let me switch layers. There we go. I have a star now instead of my club symbol. I have a heart, I have a spade, and I have a diamond. I'm going to drag out those four instances, and it doesn't really matter how I arrange them, because I promised that we would use our friend the align panel again in an earlier tutorial. With these four symbols kind of randomly aligned with one another, I'm going to select the four of them by clicking and dragging a box around them. I do not want to align them to an artboard, which is the last align option I use, because they're not even sitting currently on an artboard. They're sitting off in the pasteboard area outside of the artboards. Instead, I want to use this option of align to key object. When I choose align to key object, you'll notice that one of the symbols, in this case the diamond, gets this kind of dark red selection box around it. This has defined that diamond as the key object. I can actually click on any one of these objects and make them into the key object. A key object is going to be used as the source of alignment when I'm viewing any of the functionality within this align panel. So if I do something like align vertical centers, the spade remained exactly where it was, and the other three elements aligned to that. Next up, I'm going to use this option of distribute spacing. And I've got a preset value of 0.125 inches, which is an eighth of an inch. And if I choose this horizontal distribute button, it is going to shift things around based around where that spade was. So the spade remains locked in place, but now I have a fixed value of an eighth of an inch in between each one of these elements. And I've got something that it looks relatively uniform now, which is great. So this is the element that I want to use over and over again to be my repeating pattern on the back of my cards. So to make a pattern, very simple, very easy, I'm going to select the elements I want to use for the pattern, go to the Object menu, and down to Pattern, and choose Make. When I do that, I will jump into a new interface, which is the pattern creation or pattern editing interface. Once again, it's kind of set on a background that shows the kind of original artboard layout, but all the content from that actual design is currently hiding. That's a little bit weird, but we'll get past that. So we have this pattern options panel. Before we talk about the top 2/3 of this panel, I want to talk about the bottom third of this panel. So there's kind of a thin black gray line, dark gray line, I guess I should say, cutting off this bottom portion of the panel. This bottom portion of the panel is strictly dictating how we're seeing content inside of this editing interface. Nothing you change here is going to actually affect the pattern itself. So by default here, I'm looking at a 5x5 version of this symbols, meaning that if I zoom out a little bit, you can see that there are actually 5 repetitions of these 4 symbols, so there are 20 symbols across. And then there are 5 rows of that symbol, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is just how we're previewing what the pattern would look like. If you can't quite get a full picture of what that looks like in a larger scale, you could add more instances of it. But once again, this is just for a preview standpoint. Next up, we have the ability to change how they're dimmed. And once again, just changing how we're viewing these different instances within this editing interface. So with that said, let's go back to the top of this dialog. And just like we've seen with symbols and swatches and character styles, we get the chance to name what this pattern is going to be. So I'm going to name this card back pattern. The next option is to choose what kind of tiling we want to use. So how are we going to create this pattern? The default is to use a grid pattern, which is going to take the original selection and stack it in rows and columns perfectly and evenly. There are 4 other options here to use a kind of offset, a horizontal offset, just like bricks in a wall. Bricks by column, which would be vertical offsets, a slightly less traditional way of stacking bricks. And then we have a couple of hexagonal options, which allow things to kind of nest inside of each other, much like hexagonal elements within like a beehive. In this case, I want to use the brick by row option. And I get, because I've chosen that tile type, a brick offset option directly below that. I want to create a pattern where row to row I get a difference in colors. The default brick offset was to set them off by half or 50%. And so I am staggering my elements. So I have diamond hearts, and I have spade stars. But instead I'd like to go purple, green, purple, green. So I can switch that from half to quarter. And now I'm starting to get a pattern that looks quite a bit better. So I have star, diamond, spade, heart, star, diamond, spade. So I've got a nice, beautiful repeat there happening. They're still not quite in kind of some sort of perfect row here. And so the next whole set of properties here are adjusting the spacing that exists around those elements before they are repeated. So I had a nice 1/8 of an inch space between each one of these elements, but there's not an 1/8 of an inch space that happens between the end of this first element and the repetition of it. So I can click this size tile to art, and then I can add some horizontal and vertical spacing around this. And I can use my up and down arrows. So with that object selected, I can just use my up and down arrows to toggle through some different values. It doesn't look like I'm quite where I want to be, so maybe I can do some slightly lesser values, but let's do like 0.12 and see what that looks like. I'm not going to worry about getting perfection here, but you can see that things are looking quite a bit better now. There are almost these perfect columns. I could use a little bit of vertical spacing too. And once again, not worrying about perfection, but I've got something that looks pretty nice. So I'm going to be done with this pattern. So to be done, up in the top left-hand corner, I have the option to choose Done. And when I choose Done, that entire interface disappears, and it looks like I've lost my pattern altogether. However, I happen to already have my swatches panel open here, and you can see in my swatches panel that we used to define our playing card green and our playing card purple, we now have a new color swatch called Card Back Pattern. So if I double click on that, I would actually jump right back into the editing interface. So I could make changes to that swatch. Once again, I'm done with that, so I'm going to hit Done. I can now use that color swatch to fill objects. So I can select this green rounded rectangle that sits in this document and click to add that pattern to it. At first glance, it may look like it has only filled that card with half of the pattern, but that's because there happens to be a purple background that is hiding the purple symbols. So if I select that and delete it, the transparency will show through to the white artboard. And so you can see this pattern is now filling that original rounded rectangle shape quite nicely. These 4 original elements that I used to create my pattern are of no real use to me, so I can select those and delete them. It has no effect on the original pattern. That pattern was its own individual element now. If I do want to go back and change elements of that pattern, though, I can double click on that color swatch for the pattern and go in and edit the individual elements. So for instance, let's say I want to turn my spade upside down. So I do a 180-degree turn on that, click Done, and now back over in my pattern, you can see that all of the spades are facing downward. I'm pretty happy with that. So now I want to make some slight adjustments to how that pattern is being applied inside of this filled shape. First of all, I'm not crazy about how big these elements are. I'd like a much kind of tighter knit pattern. I could go back inside of the color swatch and simply scale down the elements within the pattern itself, but maybe a bit more easy and visual is the ability to scale it directly here inside of the interface. If I simply select the shape and scale the shape up, you'll notice that the shape and the fill scale together. So I am getting a bigger pattern, but I'm also getting a bigger shape. And vice versa, if I scale the shape down, The pattern is shrinking, but so is the shape. I want to be able to edit the pattern without affecting the container, the shape that it sits inside of. So the easiest way to do this is to use a tool that you literally may never have used in Illustrator before. It is the scale tool. For years before I knew about this functionality, I always wondered why this tool existed. I do scales all the time by simply using my selection tool and grabbing and dragging an object, holding down Shift to lock proportions, or Option to scale from the center, like we've already seen in previous parts of this tutorial. However, with the object selected, so I have the entire card back selected, if I double click on that scale tool, it will pop open with a scale dialog. In the bottom left-hand corner, I have a preview checkbox, and it's currently showing me a scale of 35% being applied to this entire object. And this is just the value that was used the last time I used this scale dialog. The final option within this dialog, though, is how this scale transformation is being applied, and there are two checkboxes. The first one is Transform Objects, and the second one is Transform Patterns. If I uncheck Transform Objects, this means this transformation will not be applied to the container, but just the pattern that sits inside of it. And so a 35% scale is much more like what I was hoping for this particular pattern. I can now go back up to the percentage that is assigned to the scale, and I like to use my arrow keys, and I can actually tap up and down to scale that percentage, and because that preview box is checked, I'm seeing those changes immediately reflected over inside of my workspace. All right, I'm going to hit OK. So that was scaling it. Next, I want to be able to nudge this pattern around a little bit. I'm not really crazy about how it's kind of aligned around the edge of this, and I've got little tiny cutoffs on the left and tiny cutoffs at the top. I might want to nudge this pattern around inside of this fill. Just like we saw with scale, if I click and move this object, it will move the pattern and the object together. Instead, I want to be able to move the pattern within that frame. This can be done even more easily with a visual interface by simply using our selection tool, but instead of just clicking and dragging, I'm going to hold down the tilde key. The tilde key being the key right next to the number 1 on your keyboard. And when I click and drag holding that, I'm actually moving the pattern without moving the container that it sits inside of. That's pretty great in itself, but once again, I have minor little changes I want to use, so once again, I can use the arrow keys to my advantage. So once again, still holding down the tilde key, if I push the up arrow, I can nudge this thing slightly upward, and if I push the left arrow, I can nudge this thing slightly left to the left. Still not quite perfect, so it would probably require a little balance of going back and forth between scaling and nudging, but between those two, you can end up with something that works really well, very quickly, very easily, building repeating patterns using the pattern maker within Adobe Illustrator. And with that said, that is the end of this 5-part tutorial. Hopefully you've learned lots of cool tricks in Adobe Illustrator that you can use across all of your Illustrator projects. And hopefully you continue running with this Illustrator project and make your own playing cards. Enjoy.